Hello everybody. So I wanted to just look for a moment at domestic violence, which is a sensitive topic for a lot of people, and I wanted to look at some of the ways that we misrepresent it in the media and how we perceive it as general public. So domestic violence is focused around what people call intimate partner violence, or IPV, and we need to separate them because the legal definition of domestic violence includes interpersonal violence plus other things. Now, nobody really has much dispute about what intimate partner violence, or IPV, is and what it isn't. And if all domestic violence was solely IPV, I don't think there'd be much of a misunderstanding. We know that if you get hit a certain level, then that's intimate partner violence, and we also know the level of it. It's somewhere between common assault and grievous bodily harm. It's worse than common assault, but it's not as bad as grievous bodily harm. And if it is, it will usually be charged as grievous bodily harm. So this is the issue. So common assault, people are not aware, that's like a punch in the face, whilst grievous bodily harm is permanent injury in a significant way, such as perhaps loss of a finger or going blind. Now, for example, one example of grievous bodily harm committed by a person in an intimate relationship was Amber Heard doing that to Johnny Depp. Now, of course, Johnny Depp didn't charge her with it, but he did lose a finger, and he has subsequently said she was responsible for chopping it off. Granted that he has said that she threw a wine bottle at his head that he dodged, it missed him, hit the wall behind him, and the ricochet of the glass cut the tip of his finger off. Now, that would still count as grievous bodily harm. Now, it's a fairly low level of grievous bodily harm, but that is above the threshold for domestic violence. In other words, if he had charged her, she wouldn't have been charged with domestic violence. She would have been charged with grievous bodily harm, and most likely would have gone to jail for perhaps around 2 or 3 years. Now, that's of course assuming that what he said is true. She has of course said other things, and I think I counted 12 different versions of what she said happened. And because legally he wrote down at the time, and he said, "No, I did it to myself by accident," because of that, it's therefore not prosecutable, or at least very difficult to prosecute. So I'm speculating rather that what he said saying now happened is true. And a court did find that they believed that it was true, that she had chopped the tip of his finger off. Now, curiously enough, Johnny Depp himself was accused of wife beating, as they call it, or domestic violence, by a gossip magazine in the United Kingdom, and he sued them for defamation but lost it, and part of the reason that he lost it was because he was suing the newspaper, not Amber Heard, and the court had ruled that her statements were similar to what the newspaper said in most of the cases. So because of that, even though we subsequently found out that they were actually lying, and the people responsible for writing the article have confessed that they were lying, and have apologised, he still had that. So the court actually found against him in that case, in spite of the fact that he actually hadn't hit her at all. But not only that, but he also got a domestic violence order out against him by Amber Heard based on these false claims. So she won in court, not just with the defamation, but actually with a domestic violence order. And she had it issued against him. She went to a court and they just issued it to her just in case. She had a bruise on her face, on her cheek. But we subsequently know that that bruise was makeup. And she was lying about it. And all of her different claims were lies. So what is the situation there is that Johnny Depp, in fact, was not a domestic violence culprit. He was not a wife basher. That was an absolute lie. And not only was he not a wife basher, but Amber Heard was a husband basher. Not only a husband basher, but worse than that, she committed grievous bodily harm. and should have gone to jail for it, was actually more severe than what she accused him of doing. Now, she also had a pattern of abuse, of swearing at him, threatening him, pooing on the bed, and all sorts of other intimidatory tactics that suggest a long pattern of abuse. He did not do anything to her. Now, the problem with all of this is that our perception is skewed. And the perception is that if you think of DV, you're always assuming that he's the man. And you're always assuming that the victim is a woman. Now, statistically speaking, that is true slightly more often than not. But it's not as big a difference as a lot of people think it is. The rate at which women experience domestic violence in their lifetime is between 30 and 36%. Well, let's round it out to about a third. Now, that's what studies have said. But the rate at which men are victims of domestic violence is 25%, or 1 in 4. Now, that doesn't fit the rhetoric, doesn't fit the narrative, so we don't get told that men are actually the victim of domestic violence almost as much as women are. Now, yes, that's a big margin, we understand that, and probably that's to do with the physical dominance and also a lot of historical parts, but women do bash men. And not only that, women bash other women. There are same-sex couples, women will bash other women, men will bash other men. In fact, there's a much higher rate of domestic violence amongst same-sex couples than amongst opposite-sex couples. Now, that's not to say that it's in any way justified for men to bash women, so much as it's saying that us thinking of it as solely a man's fault is not accurate. It's not a fair representation. This is a problem that is really more that there's certain elements of the community that are bad and certain elements of the community that perhaps fall into the trap of being their victims. Now, those people who are bad are not necessarily all men, and women can be too, and those that are victims are not necessarily all women. Now, then we also have the fact that in DV cases, they issue orders. If in doubt, they issue it. Now, there's been a lot of studies about this, and if there's even a hint of it, even a possibility that there's been any any IPV, any intimate partner violence, they will issue an order. But not only that, but domestic violence actually also includes coercion, at least in Australian law. So if you have consistent coercive practices, which can be either financial control, emotional manipulation and commitment, emotional control, and mental control. If you have any of those sorts of things, then it can also be domestic violence, even if it's not intimate partner violence. And that's a legal thing. And the reason that they've added that, and these laws started to change after 1975, the Family Violence Act changed, and there's been different changes at different times. Some of those came in different states in the 1990s and 2000s. So the reason why they added them was essentially because they were covering and masking domestic violence, because essentially they found out that most domestic violence cases, most IPV I should say, weren't being reported. And the reason that they weren't being reported was because most IPV victims were being controlled and convinced not to report. So therefore, when they specified what the control was, they said, well, with the control, if you have that sort of controlling behaviour, which again with the Amber Heard versus Johnny Depp case, Amber Heard certainly was controlling him to that extent, then we can say that there is domestic violence there, even if we don't have physical injury. So in the case of the Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard case, we had controlling behaviour by Amber Heard. Very controlling behaviour. He was hiding in rooms and so forth, and that led to him not reporting her for chopping his finger off, or chopping the tip of his finger off, which was not only an IPV incident, but actually grievous bodily harm, which is higher than IPV. It's worse, because he lost the tip of his finger that could never recover from that. It's a grievous bodily harm issue. It is on the low end of grievous bodily harm. A whole finger would have been worse, losing an eye would have been worse, but it still is not only IPV, but fully fledged grievous bodily harm. A low end, but still grievous bodily harm. He will never grow that finger back. And yes, you can say, oh, well, she was aiming the bottle to hit his head. That missed, but still the bottle was aimed to hit his head, which would have also been domestic violence. And that may have also been grievous bodily harm, depending on how much damage it did. And so that's where you have that pattern of control, the controlling behaviour. Now herein becomes the problem, because some people say, oh, you've sworn at this person once, you've put them down once, that therefore means you're a domestic violence abuser. Now if you do that all day every day and they just put up with it, then it could be, if it is a controlling. But if it's not controlling, it's not coercive, it's not trying to intimidate them and give them fear, and it's not succeeding in intimidating, because it actually has to succeed as well, then it's not domestic violence. Now they still might be charged, they might even be found guilty, because the law is such that you just have to suggest it and you'll get a conviction. But of course the convictions go away after a year unless you breach them. So in a lot of ways it's not actually domestic violence unless there's a breach. If it's a breach, then it stays on your record permanently, but if there's no breach, and if you don't do anything in that year, it doesn't stay on your record. So the problem then is we are completely misunderstanding it, don't have a clue about it, and we get the wrong idea. We assume that because someone's a man, therefore they're guilty, and we assume because they're a woman, therefore they're not guilty, and that they're the victim. That certainly wasn't the case with Amber Heard and Johnny Depp, and there are a number of other cases. Again, of course, men, only victims 25% of the time compared to between 30 and 36% for women. So our general ideas are correct, but far too swayed. We should be looking at them almost equally, but we're looking at them in a very skewed fashion, and we should stop doing that. Anyway, that's it from me. Bye bye now.